Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on Shaka Live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
It's a pleasure having you on set again.
The feeling is mutual.
Thank you. A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to your one and only Shaka Sali. Shaka, let's talk about what's been happening across the continent. Today's conversation is going to take us in different directions, but let's start in Southern Africa. New president, and now incumbent President Cyril Ramaphosa just announced his cabinet, and interestingly, he named some people that a lot of people would have said, oh no, you don't go there, especially former First Lady Zuma's wife, one of Zuma's wives, who was also the chairperson of African Union, was named one of the ministers. But let's talk about that, and maybe we compare and contrast with other countries where they have, like, for example, a bloated cabinet, like in Uganda, for example.
Yeah, first of all, I think we should correct the impression that Dr. Zuma ever, in fact, served as a First Lady of South Africa.
I stand to be corrected.
She had been married to Mr. Zuma for 10 years, but that was before Mr. Zuma became the #1 citizen of South Africa. So I can say that it's really a very interesting development from South Africa. Obviously, President Cyril Ramaphosa, as you said, has named a new cabinet. He did that, in fact, yesterday. He has come up with some interesting choices, including, at least in my view, in my biased view, for the first time, South Africa is going to have a foreign minister that is remarkably media and environmentally friendly.
Well, Shaka, somebody could say that's a sexiest term.
No, I think this lady is very smart and what have you. Lindiwe Sisulu. She also happens to come from an interesting and great political pedigree, having, of course, been born by Mr. Walter Sisulu, who has the distinction of having recruited the Madiba himself. And they spent more than 20 years together with the Madiba at Robben Island. Ms. Sisulu at one time served, in fact, as defense minister under Jacob Zuma. She had, in fact, at one time also served under Zuma before the end of apartheid in the intelligence department, which was led by Jacob Zuma himself. Now, Mr. Ramaphosa also brought back some of the ministers that had been sacked by President Jacob Zuma. And I'm talking about some of the ministers that were, in fact, in the finance docket. They are back, not specifically in that particular docket, but in different very important dockets. He also brought another very important key player who used to be Minister for Tourism under the previous administrations, but was actually, I think, sacked by Jacob Zuma or resigned during Jacob Zuma's term. And that gentleman happens to be an Afrikaner, you know, an Afrikaner Muzungu. He's back in the lineup. The other interesting thing is that the president said that he's going to reduce the number of cabinet portfolios. For now, in the interim, he says that we'll retain the departments as they are while reviewing the situation, and we'll come up later with fewer ministries. In fact, right now, I think they have about 35. So he intends to come up with about 22. That's very, very interesting, isn't it?
Well, I mean, when you look at, obviously, they pride themselves as the second largest economy on the continent, and they're talking about reducing the number of cabinet ministers to 22. That's remarkable. Take, for example, you go to a country like Uganda or South Sudan, for that matter. there are so many ministers. Some of these people don't even know what roles they play as ministers. It's just because of most of them are appointed as political cadres or political stooges for the presidents that are running those countries.
That is very true. South Africa, of course, as you say, that it is the number 2. It used to be at one time number 1. Before, of course, it was bypassed by Nigeria. But the last time I checked, in fact, it had gone a little bit down to number 3, behind Egypt. Can you believe? Under, of course, the stewardship of Jacob Zuma. But it remains still, obviously, the most or single most industrialized nation on the African continent, and should also, frankly, be the champion of democracy as we know it. Because, hey, you look at the kind of peaceful transition, really, from Jacob Zuma to his deputy president, who was then Ramaphosa, becoming president, through, in fact, a very peaceful process. And we are talking about a situation where you had 2 people, one subordinate to the other in terms of power, and yet the deputy president, in fact, would have a point of view that is different from the point of view of his boss, and still retain his position. So there is something happening in South Africa, and I hope that one of these days it would be seen or looked at as the beacon of hope for African democracy, so that some other countries in Africa can take a leaf from what is happening in South Africa and adapt it to their own situations. When you look at the democratization process, of course, on the continent, Southern Africa, alongside West Africa, seem to be doing reasonably well.
Right.
The problem seems to be in Northern Africa, the Horn of Africa, Central Africa, East Africa. In fact, the Great Lakes, as it were.
I was watching your previous show that you did on South Africa, and all the guests seem to agree that South Africa is on the right path. But they were kind of cautiously optimistic about this new cabinet that has been announced. Do you think this move by President Cyril Ramaphosa is going to maybe to take South Africa in a totally different direction?
It has sort of gotten mixed review. Mind you, it has to be an interim sort of arrangement because we are having an election coming up next year. So I think that he's probably trying to figure out how to balance the different forces so that he can retain, for example, some support from the backers of Zuma and other people. He has appointed, of course, a former Zuma ally, who is the ANC deputy president, Dr. Mabuza, who until recently was in fact the governor of Mpumalanga province. He has actually appointed him to be the deputy president of the Republic of South Africa.
Interesting, yeah.
And so this is, in a way, assures some of the supporters of Jacob Zuma that, they can still play ball and still have an opportunity to make some contribution so that the ANC can retain power. I think that the cabinet is fairly good, really, because there were reports and probably rumors that the former Minister of Finance, who was a very close ally of Zuma, was actually probably going to be kicked out. Well, he obviously wasn't kicked out of the cabinet, but he was given another portfolio in which he is not a stranger, the Home Affairs Ministry. He's going back. So it looks good, really.
Okay, let's cross over to Eastern Africa, the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia. There is still a vacuum there, no leadership in sight. We don't know what's going on. People are still protesting on the streets. The young people are all over the place demanding for reforms. Do you think this wave that has been going on in Ethiopia could bring about change? As
a matter of fact, when you talk about the circumstances that obtain in Ethiopia, you're talking about a state of emergency, so to speak. So you're talking about martial law here, really. Ethiopia pretty much is really under the governorship, as we talk, of the defense ministry, so to speak, and other security forces. As a matter of fact, authorities have given orders that the security forces should quell uprisings in the Oromia, region, which is very, very important because the Oromos happen to be the single largest ethnic community in Ethiopia, and their young people seem to be very, very active. I don't know how you can actually stop them. There is also a possibility, in fact, that one of the members of parliament who comes from the Oromia region, who was actually recently voted or elected to be chairman of the Oromian Liberation, group, could end up, in fact, being the chairman of the ruling EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. Other than having, of course, a bit of democracy in that particular ruling group, one wonders what sort of democracy is in a place where you do not even have a single member of parliament representing another point of view. You have 100% democracy, according to former U.S. National Security Advisor Dr. Susan Rice. 100% democracy. And as a matter of fact, even her boss, I'm talking about President Barack Obama, when he gave a speech out of Addis Ababa, almost in fact, referred to what was happening in Ethiopia as 100% democracy.
In fairness to them, they had one member of opposition on the...
My brother, right now you have 100% EPRDF members. But whatever it is, there is no way a country that has over 1 million human beings, sincerely, could simply have a point of view, one point of view that reflects the entire population. You're talking about a country that is the second largest in Africa, after Nigeria.
Yeah.
That's not humanly possible.
Did you mean 100 million or
100 million.
Okay.
100 million human beings that make up Ethiopia. That makes it the second largest in population after Nigeria.
There are people who have argued that, for example, the Oromia maybe should secede and form its own country. There are over 70 million people.
Well,
that makes it the single largest tribe.
I don't know that there are that many, because I think they are probably like maybe like a third, really, of the population and kind of stuff. And there are some people, of course, who have been calling for secession. They argue that historically they have been politically oppressed and marginalized, and that seems to be true when you look at the literature and you talk to a lot of observers and what have you. But I think that increasingly, because of the changing demographics, and some of them also have become very sophisticated, politically sophisticated, they realize that the only way they can perhaps get a piece of the action or a piece of the pie is by getting allies, by getting into coalitions. And right now, whether, believe it or not, they seem to be getting along with the Amhara. The Amhara are historically traditional rulers, really, until they were overthrown back in the mid-early 70s by Mengistu Haile Mariam, who even happened to be an Amhara himself. So it looks like the Oromo actually seems to be on the move. They could very well be the future, really, for the new Ethiopia. Because in terms of uprisings, for example, in terms of civil disobedience, and some sort of civil protests and what have you, they are in the front line of Ethiopia. They are the type of people that you talk about. But you have to believe that also the people who are behind the ruling party, the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, which is made up last week, I said about 90%, but I went back and it could be anywhere really between 6 and 9%. You're talking about situations, frankly, where sometimes accurate figures are very difficult to come by. So they are, yes, they command the army. They have the top military officers and what have you, but the rank and file, largely from what I have seen, is actually made up of Oromos, Amhara. Now the question is, if, for example, the senior officers of the Ethiopian National Army are going to give orders for them to quell uprisings or protests, which are organized by their kith and kin, are these soldiers in fact going to turn these guns on them, their brothers, their cousins, their sisters? It remains to be seen. So I think, frankly, that the way forward here is democracy. I think the crisis in Ethiopia presents a great opportunity where it could, in fact, trigger what you would call fundamental changes in the political system in Ethiopia as we have come to know it.
Okay, let's move along. Let's go to the comments. Let's start in Dalasaram. Let's go to Kasim. He wants to know, what will be the impact of the political situation in Tanzania, considering the fact that the President of the Republic has told people that anybody who criticizes him is going to face the full wrath of the law. For example, there's a member of parliament, an opposition member of parliament, who has been tried in court for insulting the president.
It is very unfortunate, frankly, that Tanzania, which, of course, has the commercial capital called Dar es Salaam, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania is historically referred to as the harbor of peace. The harbor of peace. But it seems increasingly, frankly, that you may probably not have the harbor of peace anymore in Tanzania. But let's face it, look at where Tanzania is. Look at the neighbors. Look at Burundi. Look at Uganda. Look at Rwanda. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. And look at, what seems to be emerging also out of their northern border, neighbors, Kenya. So why should we really surprised? Why should we think that Tanzania would be different? Because let's face it, it's so sad that a country that has a constitution, not perfect, but a constitution that guarantees, for example, the freedoms of expression, the freedoms of speech, freedoms of assembly, freedoms of worship, and what have you. In practice, it actually does not. Because criticizing a president, even though you said insulting, I don't think it is the word insulting. It was, in fact, because this member of parliament disagreed with President John Pombe Magufuli, and that he ends up, in prison for the next 6 months. And yet, let's face it, as bad as things may be in Kenya, you have a situation where there is a constitution that has helped to bring about some strong institutions, to the extent that you have actually had a lot of individuals in Kenya using abusive language to, really to the president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta. And I'm talking about among them a man who is called Joshua Miguna, the man that was, I think illegally really deported to Canada. But since then, the courts obviously have ruled that he should come back to his country. You have had a guy called Bobby Owino. He's a member of parliament from Embakasi near the international airport, Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. He has used very abusive language, as far as the president is concerned. It is true that the government has moved ahead in some cases and had him, go to police and get arrested and put him in and all kind of stuff. But then he came out again. Because let's face it, when you go to the courts the courts provide some sense of justice. So I think that the differences in Tanzania and in Kenya, for example, is because in Tanzania, yes, you do have a constitution that that allows that you provides certain freedoms, and yet the state or the judiciary system itself does not actually guarantee it. Whereas in Kenya, it could be the same thing, but the judiciary system is very, very fiercely independent, increasingly independent of its role as one of the three organs of the government.
In fact, that's an interesting point, Shaka. Let's stay in Tanzania. Let's go to another Facebook comment, this time from Lusaka, Zambia. Brian Mutembo Kapufi. He says, Magufuli is crushing dissent. What's your take? But can you also maybe compare that and contrast? For example, you have a court in Kenya challenging the executive there, saying that they should actually hand back Miguna's travel document, that they should allow him to come back and be present in court. And in Tanzania, you have an opposition leader who just criticizes the president, and he's charged in a similar court.
First of all, again, the difference, frankly, in Tanzania and Kenya, in Tanzania, it is, yes, as I said earlier, you do have a constitution that provides certain basic guarantees of freedoms, and yet those freedoms are not, for example, protected by the judiciary system. Perhaps because the judiciary system in Tanzania is not sufficiently independent. It is subordinate to the executive. The executive, of course, which is led by the president, John Pombe Magufuli. Whereas in Kenya, for example, yes, you do have a constitution that provides the same protections, the protections and the rights of the freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and what have you. But the difference here is that you do have a judiciary system that is fiercely independent and is not subordinate to the executive which is headed and led by President Uhuru Kenyatta. The executive recent times has been trying to assert itself a little bit more, to the extent that it has been trying, for example, to ignore some of the court orders that it had, to, in a sense, meet, because when when you have a court order, it is not something that is optional. It is an order. Just like when they say in the military, when they say you are walking, stop, you must stop. You don't ask why, you just stop. And by the same token, in civilian life, when a court gives you an order to appear in in the courts system and what have you, you don't even have to ask a choice. You have to go there. So they have been trying to do that, but the courts, under David Malaga, the Chief Justice, has been trying to assert itself and reassert its independence, which is guaranteed by the Constitution. So I think that's probably where there are differences. And also you have people sort of asserting themselves, asserting their rights in Kenya more so than in Tanzania.
Shaka, let's go to another comment. Let's go to Miriam BK. What's your comment on the recent brutal clashes by Rwanda on refugees in Rwanda? Especially in light that Rwanda has been in the news for trying to get refugees who are in Israel deported to Rwanda, and now they're beating up refugees from Congo.
It's very unfortunate, of course. That is what you probably expect to. That is what the refugees in Israel should probably expect to meet when they went to decide to go to Kigali. But I doubt that they are actually going to go unless they are forced, because I have seen reports suggesting that those refugees do not want to go to Rwanda, nor do they want to go to Uganda. They want to stay in Israel. And in fact, the international community, especially the United Nations, has actually given them a voice. It has come up being critical of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that, look, that's not the way to go. Even though the two countries, by the way, Uganda and Rwanda, still deny the fact that, in fact, they cut a deal with these countries, and probably their leaders received money for that particular deal. It seems there is a lot of evidence, in fact, could be incontrovertible evidence, not liable to falter, that there is a deal between those three parties.
What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk?
Tomorrow we are looking actually at the political developments in Ethiopia, a country that some exiles refer to as the hidden empire of Sheba.
Very briefly, talk about the political situation in Uganda. You had Museveni invite all the MPs, the 318 MPs who voted for him, and hosted them to a party.
Well, there are celebrations. They celebrated the 317 members of parliament, according to President Yoweri Museveni, are heroes, and they're the latest revolutionary, sort of historicals. They are the historicals in terms of his recent, I don't know whether you should call it revolutionary kind of, way of looking at things, or whether it is part of the democratization process of Uganda, according to him. As far as he's concerned, they are the recent historicals that, of course, gave him an opportunity to look forward to being a presidential monarch.
Well, on that note, Shaka, thank you so much again for being a great guest. I'll see you on another edition next week. Until then, keep those comments coming. See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, too.
Yeah, thank you.